The palace, in all its grandeur, has always been a symbol of power, elegance, and timeless tradition. But behind the gilded walls, the whispers, secrets, and shadows are far darker than the public ever imagines. What if I told you that one of the monarchy's most controversial figures could be facing the ultimate disgrace, not for scandalous words or leaked letters, but for something far more shocking, something that involves one of the most beloved women in modern history, Princess Diana? What if the treasures she left behind, the jewelry she cherished and wore as symbols of her life, love, and loss, were suddenly being sold, quietly, secretly, and without permission, by someone within the palace itself? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It sounds like the beginning of a dramatic tabloid headline, the kind that makes headlines across the world, triggering outrage, disbelief, and endless speculation. Yet, tonight, that headline is not fiction. The story you are about to hear unfolds in the shadowed corridors of Buckingham Palace, a world of absolute opulence where the air itself seems heavy with secrets. Imagine, for a moment, walking through those ancient halls, past portraits of monarchs long gone, past polished marble floors that reflect a history of ceremony, pomp, and secrecy. Now imagine discovering that behind some of those doors that are supposedly locked, protected, and untouched, lie items of inestimable value, jewels that belong to Diana, the people's princess, stolen from memory and legacy, sold for profit. And the one accused of orchestrating this? Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall. It's a story that shocks the imagination. Camilla has always been a figure of controversy, often viewed through the prism of Diana's tragic legacy. But this is not a story of mere public opinion or cold media bias. This is a story that could change the perception of the monarchy forever, revealing cracks in the palace's seemingly flawless facade. It raises questions no one dares to ask aloud. How secure is the royal family's private world? How deep can ambition, desperation, or greed go, even in the most protected of institutions? And most chillingly, could someone so close to the crown exploit their proximity for personal gain? Consider the jewelry itself. These aren't just diamonds and gold. Each piece carries weight, history, emotion. The bracelets Diana wore when attending charity galas, the necklaces gifted by the crown, rings that symbolized her role as a mother and public figure, carefully curated over decades. Pieces that were meant to remain in the family, preserved as treasures for generations. And now, according to insiders, these very symbols of memory, love, and legacy have allegedly been sold in secret transactions that no one outside the palace was meant to know about. Imagine the shockwaves reverberating through the royal court, the Queen's trusted advisors, long-standing palace staff, and of course, the public who still hold Diana in reverence. The story begins with a discovery, almost by accident. A private investigator, hired discreetly by a concerned member of the palace staff, noticed unusual activity, documents that shouldn't have existed, transactions that didn't add up, and whispers among staff that something precious was disappearing from the vaults. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. A necklace missing here, a pair of earrings unaccounted for there, a record of a shipment abroad that didn't match any official palace inventory. And at the center of it all, Camilla, whose motives, history, and personal ambitions now stand under a microscope brighter than any chandelier in the throne room. But what makes this story even more compelling is timing. This isn't ancient history or a relic of the past. The events we are tracing happened recently, in a palace that has always prided itself on image, discretion, and order. And now, everything is unraveling. The consequences are immediate. Staff in turmoil, palace officials scrambling to assess damage, and whispers leaking into the press, threatening not only reputations but the very structure of trust within the royal family. And while the palace tries to contain the fallout, the world watches, riveted by the spectacle. After all, Diana's legacy is sacred to millions around the globe, and any perceived violation of that legacy is nothing short of explosive. Let's not underestimate the emotional stakes. Diana represented more than royalty. She symbolized compassion, authenticity, and resilience. Her life, tragically cut short, left a void filled with both admiration and grief. Her jewelry, her personal belongings, are not just material objects. They are artifacts of memory, of a life lived in public view yet profoundly private pain. To imagine them being used for personal gain is more than just betrayal. It is, in many eyes, sacrilege. And that's exactly why this story is gripping. We are not just uncovering financial improprieties. We are unraveling a tale of human ambition clashing with sacred legacy, a story that raises profound questions about morality, loyalty, and the corrosive nature of power. Yet, the drama does not end with discovery. The investigation itself has been fraught with deception. Camilla's defenders claim innocence, arguing that any transactions were approved, legitimate, or misinterpreted. But whistleblowers paint a different picture, a shadowy narrative where secrecy, manipulation, and self-interest override loyalty and ethics. Staff who once revered her reportedly grew fearful, aware that the corridors they once walked freely now harbor suspicion, betrayal, and the looming threat of scandal. Every jewel that vanished left a ripple, every whispered conversation a tremor, and every concealed document a growing storm. And there is the public angle. The world watches the monarchy with fascination, reverence, and at times, scrutiny bordering on obsession. The thought of Diana's legacy being compromised is more than a headline. It's an emotional charge that taps into collective memory. People who adored Diana, who still feel a connection to her through charity work, films, and photographs, are shocked, outraged, and captivated by even a hint of scandal. The palace, always so adept at controlling narrative, now faces the impossible. Contain the truth without appearing complicit, protect the legacy of a beloved figure, and manage the reputation of a current figure accused of betrayal. It is a delicate, dangerous balance, and every decision risks inflaming a public already emotionally invested. So, why are we telling this story now? Because the pieces are falling into place, and the moment has arrived when secrets that once seemed secure are now exposed to daylight. Documents have surfaced, insiders have spoken, and the evidence, though complex and sometimes contradictory, points toward one conclusion. Someone close to the heart of the monarchy exploited that closeness in ways that could never have been imagined. And yet, as the scandal brews, questions remain unanswered. Who authorized the sales, if anyone? Were there accomplices? And perhaps the most unsettling question, what does this mean for the future of the monarchy itself? Tonight, we are going to take you behind the gilded doors, into the hidden rooms, and through the scandalous events that led to the alleged sale of Diana's treasured jewelry. We will explore the personalities, motivations, and stakes involved. We will examine evidence, testimonies, and insider accounts. And along the way, we will uncover twists that will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, loyalty, and ambition in one of the world's most scrutinized institutions. But the story doesn't just end with theft or loss. It's about consequences, personal, political, and emotional. It's about the reverberations that shake not just the palace walls, but the very perception of monarchy in the modern age. And it's about Camilla, a figure many thought they understood, now cast in a light that raises uncomfortable questions. How far can ambition push someone in the shadow of a legend? And is the world ready for the answers that are about to emerge? The palace will not admit it publicly, at least, not yet. But insiders hint at drastic measures, whispered warnings, and decisions that could alter the hierarchy, influence the public narrative, and even redefine the rules of engagement within the royal household. And as the investigation deepens, as documents are scrutinized and deals traced, one truth becomes undeniable. The palace is on the brink of a scandal that will be remembered for generations. And so we begin. What came next would shake the foundations of tradition, power, and loyalty. What began as the disappearance of jewels would reveal hidden ambitions, secret deals, and betrayals that no one saw coming. But before we dive into the labyrinth of intrigue, the first question you must ask yourself is this: who really benefits from the fall of a duchess, and at what cost to the memory of a princess? The story is far from over, and the first revelations are only the beginning. Behind every sparkling diamond and gleaming gold bracelet lies a story of betrayal, power, and greed, and those stories are about to come to light. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Few people have ever truly seen the inner workings of Buckingham Palace. To the public, it's a symbol of elegance, tradition, and ceremonial grandeur. But step beyond the well-known rooms, beyond the glittering state dining halls and glittering chandeliers, and you enter a world most have never imagined. Hallways echo with history. Doors are locked with codes known only to a select few. And behind some of those doors lie treasures beyond imagination, artifacts of power, history, and personal memory. Among them, Diana's jewelry collection. A set of items so precious, so emblematic of the woman she was, that their very existence seems almost sacred. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be in a room where history itself is tangible? To see objects that have touched royalty, that have witnessed state affairs, weddings, funerals, and moments of joy and sorrow? That is what the palace vaults represent. They are more than storage. They are a testament to centuries of power and secrecy. And yet, in this world of extreme security, one question looms. How could anyone, let alone someone within the royal household, move these treasures without leaving a trace? The answer, as it turns out, lies in trust and in human ambition. The vaults themselves are a marvel of design. Reinforced doors, biometric locks, and round-the-clock security are standard. But even the most sophisticated systems cannot account for the subtle manipulations of someone who knows the palace as intimately as Camilla. Longtime staff, some having served decades, spoke of her familiarity with routines, her ability to navigate both protocol and secrecy with ease. That familiarity, combined with proximity to authority, creates opportunity and, according to insiders, temptation. The story begins with a subtle discrepancy. It was not an alarm that sounded, nor a loud disturbance that prompted investigation. Instead, it was a small note in a ledger, a shipment unaccounted for, a piece missing from an inventory that had been meticulously recorded for decades. A staff member, initially unsure whether to speak, eventually alerted a private investigator who had been quietly observing palace transactions for unrelated reasons. The initial report was almost mundane. A necklace, a bracelet, and a set of earrings had vanished without explanation. But as they dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge, one that pointed unmistakably to deliberate action. It's here that we start to see the layers of human behavior at play. The palace is not just a building. It's a microcosm of power dynamics, loyalty, and fear. Staff are deeply loyal to the institution, and yet fear and curiosity coexist in equal measure. The deeper investigators probed, the more they realized that what they were seeing wasn't random theft or incompetence. This was orchestrated, deliberate, and cunning. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, who to manipulate, and how to cover their tracks. And the name that repeatedly surfaced, according to insiders, was Camilla. Think about that for a moment. Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, long under the glare of public scrutiny in palace politics, accused of something that, if true, goes beyond any ordinary scandal. The idea is almost cinematic. A high-ranking member of the royal family, walking the halls, attending public engagements, while simultaneously orchestrating secret sales of items meant to honor the memory of one of the most beloved women in the world. It's a story of contrasts. Loyalty versus betrayal, public persona versus private action, the glimmer of diamonds versus the shadows of deception. But how could it happen? How could someone navigate the labyrinthine security, the layers of protocol, and the watchful eyes of staff and advisors? Insiders describe a combination of charm, authority, and subtle intimidation. Camilla's knowledge of palace routines allowed her to move with a quiet confidence that left little evidence. Documents were shifted, shipments misrecorded, and transactions disguised in legitimate-sounding channels. To an outsider, nothing appeared amiss. To those closest to the operation, every movement was deliberate, calculated, and increasingly audacious. Yet even audacity carries risk. Each missing piece raised questions, small at first, then growing louder. Staff noticed subtle changes. Vaults accessed at unusual hours, inventory logs altered slightly, whispers among colleagues that something was not right. And with every passing day, the stakes rose. The palace, long accustomed to projecting an image of control and perfection, now faced a reality that was messy, human, and deeply troubling. The jewels, symbols of Diana's life and legacy, were more than objects. They were testaments to loyalty and memory. To imagine them being manipulated, moved, and potentially sold sent shockwaves through the palace corridors that few outside could comprehend. Investigators described the vaults themselves as intimidating, almost claustrophobic despite their grandeur. Rows upon rows of secure storage, each drawer, each safe meticulously labeled, each piece documented. The jewelry wasn't just beautiful, it was a record of history, carefully maintained and preserved. And yet, the more they studied the missing items, the more evidence suggested internal knowledge. Someone with intimate access had orchestrated movements that no outsider could replicate. Then came the human element. One long-serving aide, who wished to remain anonymous, recalled the subtle changes in Camilla's demeanor. Small requests, seemingly innocent questions about logistics, were interpreted differently in hindsight. She moved with precision, the aide said. It was never careless. Always measured, always watched. For insiders, it became clear that this was not a one-time lapse or error. It was a sustained series of actions, each step building toward an outcome that, until recently, had remained hidden from public view. The implications of this discovery are staggering. It's not just about missing jewelry. It's about the trust the monarchy places in those closest to it, the vulnerability of tradition, and the collision between private ambition and public expectation. Every jewel unaccounted for is a ripple in the monarchy's carefully managed image. Every suspicious transaction adds fuel to a story that, for the first time, challenges the notion that the palace is untouchable. And the more investigators dug, the more they realized the scope was broader than a few pieces of jewelry. It involved money, secrecy, and relationships that could reshape the palace hierarchy. And yet, for all the intrigue, the most shocking moment was yet to come. Documents, testimonies, and financial records began to converge on one central figure. Camilla's role was no longer speculative. And as the palace braced for confrontation, as questions of loyalty and legality began to surface, one fact became undeniable. This was not just a scandal. This was a potential seismic shift in the story of the royal family. The implications would ripple far beyond Buckingham Palace, reaching the global public who still hold Diana's memory close, and raising questions that go straight to the heart of power, trust, and ambition. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every piece of Diana's jewelry carries a story. Every necklace, bracelet, and ring is more than gold or diamonds. It is a symbol, a memory, a fragment of a life lived under the unforgiving glare of the public eye. To understand the gravity of what allegedly happened in the palace, you have to understand not just the physical beauty of these items, but the emotional weight they carry. They are, in a sense, the fingerprints of Diana's legacy. And the thought that they might have been sold, surreptitiously, by someone like Camilla sends a ripple through history, memory, and the royal family itself. Imagine for a moment walking into a room filled with her treasures. The glitter of diamonds catches the light in ways that feel almost alive. Pearls that have adorned her neck at countless state events rest in velvet-lined cases. Each brooch, each cocktail ring, represents moments frozen in time. A gift from a lover, a token of friendship, a celebratory piece marking an achievement. And then consider that someone with access and knowledge of these vaults may have taken them without consent. It's not just theft, it's an assault on memory, on history, and on the emotional resonance of a life that inspired millions. Diana's life was marked by contrasts, public adoration and private struggle, fairy tale weddings and deep personal loss, unwavering compassion and intense scrutiny. Her jewelry reflected that duality. The sapphires and diamonds were not just luxurious. They were statements, carefully chosen to convey strength, elegance, and approachability. Every public appearance was choreographed, down to the pieces she wore, yet each item also carried personal significance, a hidden narrative that only those close to her could truly understand. And now, the thought that someone within the palace could exploit that significance for personal gain is a betrayal on multiple levels. The most iconic piece in this collection is the sapphire engagement ring. the one that now sits on the hand of a royal who is not Diana. But beyond that, there are dozens of pieces that have never been in the public eye, worn only at private events, kept in secure storage, or gifted in intimate moments. These pieces are more than adornment. They are vessels of memory, and insiders suggest that several of these rare, irreplaceable items have vanished, allegedly sold through channels so discreet that their disappearance was only noticed because of meticulous accounting and the intuition of palace staff. Consider the psychological weight of this scenario. For staff who have served the royal family for decades, the disappearance of these items is almost incomprehensible. Loyalty runs deep in the palace, yet the realization that someone within the inner circle might betray that trust is jarring. The pieces are not just valuable, they are sacred, imbued with the essence of a woman who continues to captivate the world years after her death. Every sale, every secret transaction, represents not just a material loss, but a rupture in the symbolic fabric of her legacy. The intrigue deepens when you consider the logistics. How does one move such high-profile items without attracting attention? The palace's security is legendary, yet insiders describe subtle methods that allowed for discreet transfers. Access schedules, knowledge of when surveillance was minimal, the ability to manipulate or misdirect staff. These small, calculated actions, repeated over time, could enable someone with insider knowledge to execute a plan that outsiders might consider impossible. And according to whispers from palace aides, Camilla had exactly that knowledge, a familiarity with palace routines that made her movements almost invisible. But this story is about more than logistics. It's about the intersection of human ambition and emotional resonance. Camilla's alleged actions, if true, speak to a deep understanding of both. She knew the significance of each piece, the emotional and symbolic value they held, and yet, she allegedly acted in a way that served her interests rather than preserving the sanctity of the collection. That tension between personal desire and public duty is what makes the scandal so gripping and so morally complex. Diana's jewelry also represents the unspoken expectations placed upon women in the royal family. Each piece was a statement, a message in the unspoken language of monarchy. To wear a particular brooch could signal solidarity, support, or alignment with a cause. To gift or sell such a piece carries implications far beyond mere transaction. It becomes a narrative, a reflection of influence, power, and intention. Allegedly moving these items for private gain is more than a breach of protocol. It's a manipulation of the subtle, intricate communication embedded in royal tradition. And the public perception cannot be ignored. Diana remains, decades after her death, a figure of immense public fascination and affection. Her jewelry, iconic in both media and memory, represents a link to her persona. To imagine these treasures being removed, sold, or concealed generates not just shock, but a profound sense of betrayal among those who admired her. It is, in effect, a violation of collective memory, a challenge to the way her life and legacy have been preserved in the public consciousness. Yet, insiders suggest the story does not end with the disappearance of items. Evidence points to intentionality, planning, and a level of sophistication that implies not a simple lapse in judgment, but a carefully executed series of actions. Financial records, shipping logs, and testimony from palace aides indicate that the transactions were structured to avoid immediate detection. Some items were allegedly routed through intermediaries, others disguised under seemingly legitimate purposes. The deeper the investigation goes, the clearer the pattern becomes, a deliberate orchestration designed to obscure responsibility while allowing access to immense value. This brings us to the emotional core of the scandal. Jewelry is not just material. It is memory, sentiment, and identity. To remove it from its intended context is to alter history itself. For Diana, whose life was constantly dissected in public, the preservation of her personal effects was a way to maintain control over her narrative, even after death. To have those items allegedly sold by someone so closely linked to the monarchy is a profound violation, one that reverberates through staff, family, and the public alike. It's also important to understand the strategic significance of these items. Beyond emotional resonance, they represent currency. Social, political, and financial. A high-profile piece of jewelry does not exist in isolation. It is a marker of prestige, a token that can influence relationships and reputation. By allegedly selling or transferring these pieces, the action is not merely about money. It's about influence, leverage, and the power to shape perception. And for Camilla, who has long navigated a complex web of scrutiny, public perception, and private ambition, that leverage could be extraordinarily valuable. Yet, despite the gravity of the allegations, there is an element of contradiction. Camilla is publicly celebrated for her composure, charity work, and royal duties. To imagine her orchestrating a secret sale of Diana's jewels seems almost inconceivable, an ironic twist that adds depth to the scandal. It's a juxtaposition of public virtue and private controversy, a tension that fascinates, horrifies, and keeps the world watching. It forces us to question the narratives we accept, the assumptions we make, and the complexities hidden behind the polished image of monarchy. As investigators and insiders continued to piece together the puzzle, certain questions remained central. What drove the alleged actions? Was it greed, ambition, or something more subtle, a desire for control, influence, or to reshape the narrative of the royal family itself? And how did someone so visible, so scrutinized, think they could act without consequence? Each of these questions adds layers of tension to the story, drawing us deeper into the palace corridors where history, power, and personal ambition collide. And then there is the missing piece, both literally and figuratively. While some items have been traced through various channels, others remain unaccounted for. One particularly rare necklace, worn by Diana during a critical public event, has vanished completely. Its disappearance is emblematic of the broader scandal, not just about wealth, but about the preservation of legacy, the vulnerability of trust, and the tension between personal desire and moral obligation. Its absence leaves a vacuum in the narrative, one that investigators, insiders, and the public are desperate to fill. The palace, as always, is a world of dualities. Opulent beauty and hidden shadows, loyalty and fear, transparency and secrecy. The alleged sale of Diana's jewelry crystallizes all of these tensions into a story that is as emotionally compelling as it is shocking. It challenges assumptions, provokes outrage, and compels us to ask questions we might otherwise avoid. And as the investigation deepened, the narrative became clearer. This was not merely a tale of missing jewels. It was a window into ambition, power, and the human complexities that lurk behind the palace doors. But just when it seemed the scope of the scandal was understood, new evidence emerged, threatening to overturn everything investigators thought they knew. Hidden ledgers, cryptic correspondences, and insider confessions hinted at a network far more complex than a single individual could manage. The story was expanding, reaching beyond Diana's jewels to implicate relationships, financial arrangements, and a series of decisions that would shock the monarchy itself. What came next would escalate the scandal beyond imagination, and the world would watch in disbelief. Every royal figure has a story, a journey shaped by circumstance, ambition, and public perception. Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, is no exception, but her story is layered, contradictory, and often misunderstood. To fully grasp the gravity of the allegations surrounding Diana's jewelry, we have to understand who Camilla is, how she rose through the ranks of the royal family, and the controversies that have long followed her, because her past, her reputation, and her ambitions are inseparable from the scandal now unfolding. Camilla's early life was marked by privilege, yes, but also by a sense of longing for recognition and connection. She moved in social circles steeped in tradition, etiquette, and expectation. Charm, poise, and intelligence were essential tools, qualities she cultivated from a young age. But what set her apart was not just social grace, it was resilience. Camilla learned early that perception could be just as powerful as reality, and she became adept at navigating both. This skill would later define her trajectory within the royal family and, according to insiders, allow her to maneuver in ways that others could not. Her relationship with Prince Charles is, of course, central to any understanding of her influence. From the outset, it was controversial, fraught with secrecy, public scrutiny, and comparison to Diana. For decades, the public narrative painted her as the other woman, a figure of intrigue and blame in a tragic love story. Yet behind the headlines, there were nuances. Camilla cultivated a persona that balanced discretion with strategic visibility. She understood the stakes. Reputation in the royal family is currency, influence is power, and patience can be as potent as bold action. The public often underestimates the level of scrutiny within the palace. Every gesture, word, and appearance is analyzed, sometimes magnified beyond reason. For Camilla, that meant navigating not only her personal relationships, but also the politics of a centuries-old institution. Every misstep could be amplified, every success quietly noted, rarely celebrated. It is within this tension, between ambition and restraint, public perception and private strategy, that the alleged actions surrounding Diana's jewelry must be understood. Camilla, as insiders describe, has long demonstrated an ability to operate within these shadows, often unseen but always calculating. Her rise to the position of Duchess of Cornwall was neither swift nor simple. It involved alliances, diplomacy, and an intricate understanding of palace hierarchy. Staff and insiders often remark on her meticulous attention to detail. How she knows which doors to open, which conversations to initiate, and how to navigate the delicate balance of influence without overstepping. This mastery of protocol and human psychology may seem benign in ordinary circumstances, but in the context of the jewelry scandal, it becomes chilling. The very skills that allowed her to succeed publicly also made her capable of orchestrating actions behind the scenes without immediate detection. Controversies have followed Camilla throughout her adult life. Public opinion has been unforgiving at times, fueled by comparisons to Diana and by tabloid narratives. But within the palace, insiders suggest a more nuanced reality. She has supporters who admire her intelligence, social savvy, and charity work. She has detractors who question motives, ambition, and loyalty. And in a world where perception is everything, these contrasting views create an environment ripe for secrecy, manipulation, and intrigue. The allegations regarding Diana's jewelry intersect directly with this history. To understand them, we have to recognize that Camilla's proximity to power provided both opportunity and motive. She has long been deeply involved in charitable activities, public engagements, and royal duties, giving her access to networks, knowledge, and influence few could rival. Combine that with a palace culture where discretion is expected and documentation can be obscured, and the stage is set for actions that are both strategic and concealed. But here lies the contradiction. Camilla's public image emphasizes stability, composure, and duty, yet the allegations suggest bold, perhaps reckless action behind closed doors. The duality is striking. On one hand, she is the composed duchess, attending engagements, meeting dignitaries, and maintaining a polished public persona. On the other, she is allegedly involved in secret transactions that exploit a legacy belonging to another woman, a legacy revered by millions worldwide. The tension between public virtue and private ambition makes the story compelling, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Insiders describe moments that hint at her calculated approach. Small but significant gestures in meetings, subtle questioning of staff, careful monitoring of inventory, and knowledge of when security protocols were most vulnerable. According to some accounts, these behaviors were consistent over time, a pattern suggesting foresight rather than spontaneity. For investigators, these observations added layers of complexity because they indicated not only intent but also understanding of palace dynamics, human behavior, and risk management. And yet, even as these patterns emerged, Camilla maintained her public image. She attended charity events with poise, smiled for cameras, and projected an aura of normalcy that starkly contrasted with the brewing investigation. It is this duality that fascinates palace insiders, journalists, and the public alike. How can someone maintain absolute composure in public while allegedly orchestrating actions that could irreparably harm reputations, relationships, and legacies? It is a question that continues to drive both investigation and speculation. Her controversies, too, add layers of intrigue. Over the years, Camilla has been accused of manipulation, ambition, and opportunism. Some of these accusations are rooted in public perception, others in whispered palace narratives. They form a backdrop against which the alleged jewelry scandal must be understood. For those within the palace, these past controversies provide context. They reveal character, tendencies, and patterns of behavior that could explain how someone might act in secret, with sophistication and subtlety. It's also essential to consider the psychological dynamics at play. Camilla operates in a world where power, influence, and control are inextricably linked to reputation. The ability to act without immediate detection is not merely a skill, it is survival. In this context, the alleged sale of Diana's jewelry is not simply a matter of greed. It may also reflect strategic calculation, a way to exert influence, navigate palace politics, or assert agency in an environment that has often scrutinized and constrained her. Public perception, however, is relentless. To millions, Diana remains an untouchable icon, and any violation of her memory is unforgivable. Camilla, already a polarizing figure, is thus placed in a narrative where public judgment is immediate, intense, and emotionally charged. The juxtaposition of personal ambition with public condemnation creates a high-stakes environment, one in which every action carries enormous consequences. And for the palace, managing the fallout becomes a delicate exercise in damage control, reputation management, and narrative framing. And yet, despite the gravity of these considerations, insiders report that Camilla's alleged actions were audacious, almost daring. Moving high-value items, exploiting trust, and navigating palace protocols without raising immediate alarms requires a blend of confidence, knowledge, and subtlety. These qualities, which have defined her rise and sustained her influence, also make the allegations plausible in the eyes of investigators. The skills that elevated her socially and politically may have been the same skills that facilitated the alleged scandal. The most striking aspect, according to palace insiders, is the emotional complexity. Camilla is not simply a figure of ambition. She is a woman who has experienced public scrutiny, personal criticism, and the pressure of navigating a high-profile marriage. These experiences shape behavior, decision-making, and risk assessment. In the context of the jewelry scandal, they provide insight into why someone might act covertly, balancing personal gain, reputation, and loyalty in a high-pressure environment where mistakes can be catastrophic. And yet, even with all this knowledge, no one expected the next move. The investigation was unfolding, evidence accumulating, and whispers growing louder, but the palace hierarchy remained uncertain. The implications of Camilla's alleged involvement were staggering, touching not just on material loss but on moral questions, legacy, and the very fabric of trust within the royal household. Every step forward in the investigation added tension, as palace officials wrestled with whether to act discreetly, confront publicly, or attempt containment. The story of Camilla's rise, her controversies, and her alleged actions provides the backdrop for what comes next. The disappearance of Diana's jewelry. Understanding her journey is crucial because it highlights the intersection of ambition, opportunity, and strategic thinking that makes this scandal both plausible and extraordinary. And just as the public believes they understand Camilla, the next revelation is about to shatter assumptions, revealing layers of intrigue that extend far beyond what anyone anticipated. What came next would force the palace to confront truths they had long hoped to ignore. And the consequences would reverberate far beyond the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A missing brooch here, a set of earrings unaccounted for there. At first, palace staff chalked it up to human error, misfiled items, documentation mistakes, simple oversight. But the pattern soon became impossible to ignore. Pieces of Diana's personal collection, some of them irreplaceable, began vanishing from the palace vaults. And the initial calm, the sense that the palace was untouchable, gave way to alarm, suspicion, and fear. Imagine working in a place where every item, every document, every action is recorded, scrutinized, and cross-checked. Staff are trained, loyal, and meticulous. Security is state-of-the-art, a combination of surveillance cameras, access codes, and human observation. For items to disappear under these conditions requires more than opportunity. It requires knowledge. It requires careful planning, patience, and an understanding of human behavior. And according to insiders, that knowledge and access pointed in one direction. Camilla. The first discrepancies were discovered in a routine inventory check. Staff noticed that a necklace, one Diana had worn at a charity gala, was missing from its designated case. It wasn't simply misplaced. The inventory records indicated it had never left the palace, yet it could not be found. At first, whispers circulated among aides and curators. Could it have been removed for cleaning? Loaned for an exhibition? The official explanations seemed plausible, until other items began to disappear in the same mysterious manner. Within weeks, what appeared to be isolated incidents formed a pattern. Bracelets, rings, and pins, all high-value, high-profile pieces, were no longer accounted for. Investigators brought in by palace officials began to dig deeper, tracing the movements of each item, examining security logs, and interviewing staff. What they uncovered was chilling. Someone with intimate knowledge of the palace's routines was moving these items without triggering alarms or raising immediate suspicion. It was not theft in the traditional sense. It was orchestrated, calculated, and deliberate. Consider the logistics of such an operation. These are not ordinary items. They are heavy, meticulously cataloged, and stored in locked, monitored vaults. Removing them requires physical access, an understanding of the security systems, and the ability to anticipate when human oversight might be minimal. Yet somehow, these pieces moved from vault to private storage, sometimes under the guise of legitimate handling, other times with no record at all. Staff who were initially loyal and trusting began to feel the first stirrings of fear, aware that someone close to the crown could be manipulating the system. The psychological impact on the palace staff was immediate. Loyalty and trust, the cornerstones of their service, were shaken. They began to question routines, scrutinize colleagues, and even wonder whether their own complicity had been unknowingly leveraged. What was once a predictable, controlled environment became charged with tension, suspicion, and uncertainty. Every locked door and every vault became a potential site of intrigue. Investigators noted the sophistication of the alleged operation. Transactions were masked, records falsified or misdirected, and shipments routed through intermediaries. Some items appeared to leave the palace under legitimate pretenses, only to resurface in private collections far from public view. The deeper the probe went, the clearer it became that this was not random behavior. It was a series of actions designed to exploit trust, conceal intent, and maximize control over high-value assets. And yet, despite the sophistication, mistakes began to surface. One staff member, who had grown suspicious, noticed subtle anomalies in paperwork, signatures that did not match, discrepancies in dates, and minor adjustments to logs that should have gone unnoticed. These small details, when pieced together, painted a troubling picture. Someone was not only accessing the jewels, but also manipulating records to avoid detection. And the fingerprints of authority, according to insiders, pointed repeatedly toward Camilla. Public perception, of course, remained unaware at first. To the outside world, the palace continued its smooth operations, formal events, charitable engagements, and public appearances. Camilla maintained her composure, attending functions and presenting the image of normalcy that insiders have long noted as a hallmark of her approach. The contrast between public poise and private controversy created a tension that was almost cinematic, a story of hidden ambition and quiet manipulation unfolding beneath layers of tradition and ceremony. But for those within the palace, the stakes were tangible and urgent. The missing jewelry represented more than material loss. It was a violation of legacy, a breach of trust, and a potential public relations nightmare. Diana's collection was symbolic, each piece tied to personal history, charitable work, and public memory. Its disappearance was not merely about money. It was about memory, reputation, and the perception of the monarchy itself. Every missing item intensified the sense of crisis, forcing palace officials to consider options they had never imagined. Confront the suspected party, attempt to quietly recover the items, or risk exposure to a scandal that could engulf the family in global media scrutiny. The investigation grew more complex as evidence accumulated. Financial records suggested transactions routed through intermediaries and shell accounts, designed to obscure origins and destinations. Insider accounts described subtle movements within the palace, items appearing in private spaces and disappearing again without explanation. It became clear that this was not a one-off incident, but an organized pattern, carried out over time with deliberate intent. The human and logistical elements combined in a way that made the scandal almost inevitable once discovered. And then came the moment that shocked even experienced investigators. One of Diana's most iconic pieces, a sapphire necklace worn at an event of international significance, was found to have been moved in a manner that suggested intentional concealment. Security logs had been adjusted, staff who were in the vicinity had no recollection, and documents appeared altered to remove the trace of its movement. The realization hit investigators like a thunderbolt. The disappearance was not just a logistical anomaly. It was an act of strategy, executed by someone who understood the palace and its vulnerabilities intimately. The palace hierarchy faced an impossible dilemma: how to respond to allegations that implicated a senior member of the family, how to maintain secrecy while investigating internally, and how to balance loyalty, duty, and justice in an institution that values appearance as much as substance. Each decision carried enormous risk, not only for those involved, but for the monarchy's reputation worldwide. The missing jewelry had become more than items. They were symbols of vulnerability, intrigue, and the potential for catastrophic fallout. Yet even as the investigation deepened, one truth became apparent. The disappearance was not random, it was personal. Each item missing had been carefully selected, not simply valuable in a monetary sense, but meaningful in terms of Diana's life, public image, and legacy. This suggested motive, foresight, and knowledge, raising questions that were impossible to ignore. Why these items? Who would benefit from their removal? And how far did the orchestration extend? The answer, according to insiders, was unsettling. Evidence increasingly pointed to someone who had both motive and access. Camilla, as the person closest to the events, became the central figure in a narrative that combined ambition, secrecy, and audacity. Her understanding of the palace, her control of perception, and her ability to navigate protocol had allegedly enabled the removal of items that many assumed were untouchable. It was a bold, calculated maneuver that, if proven true, would be unprecedented in modern royal history. But just as investigators thought they were beginning to understand the scope, a new revelation emerged, one that threatened to rewrite everything they believed about the thefts. Documents surfaced suggesting that the movement of certain items was not only deliberate, but also potentially part of a wider scheme involving parties outside the palace, individuals whose identities and motives remained concealed. This development expanded the scandal from a matter of internal betrayal to a complex web of transactions, intrigue, and secrecy that could extend far beyond the royal household. What came next would reveal the full scale of the operation, the audacity of the alleged orchestrators, and the shocking consequences that were about to unfold. Consequences that would shake the palace, the monarchy, and the world watching closely. In a place like Buckingham Palace, silence is rarely silent. Every corridor, every ornate hall, carries echoes of whispers, rumors, secrets, and conjecture that move faster than any formal communication. The palace operates on both formal protocol and informal networks. For decades, these networks have been the lifeblood of how staff communicate, share observations, and even protect themselves. And in the case of Diana's missing jewelry, these whispers became a wildfire, spreading anxiety, suspicion, and anticipation throughout the household. It started with small murmurs. A housekeeper noticed a piece of paper in the vault that didn't match the usual protocol. A senior aide saw an unfamiliar face near the jewelry storage during off hours. These were small anomalies, easily dismissed by those unfamiliar with palace life. But insiders describe how, in a place governed by routine, even the smallest deviations stand out like a flashing red light. Staff are trained to notice patterns, to detect inconsistencies, and to act when something seems amiss. And once the first few noticed, the word began to spread. By the time the rumors reached the senior staff, they were already layered with speculation. Stories of missing items were accompanied by conjecture about who might be responsible, motivations behind the actions, and possible consequences. In a palace accustomed to order and discretion, The mere act of whispering became both a coping mechanism and a tool for survival. Staff were aware that the wrong word, repeated to the wrong person, could have career-ending consequences, or worse, implicate them in the scandal by association. These whispers also began to infiltrate perceptions of Camilla. Some aides described her as unusually composed, a calm presence amid growing uncertainty. Others interpreted her behavior differently, seeing calculated movements and subtle interactions that seemed designed to observe reactions, gauge suspicion, and maintain control over the narrative. In a palace environment, small gestures matter. A nod here, a glance there, a question that seems casual but reveals awareness of ongoing concerns. Observers began to note patterns in her behavior that aligned, in hindsight, with the emerging scandal. And then came the rumors about the jewelry itself. Staff claimed that certain pieces had been shifted to different storage areas, only to be returned later with no clear explanation. Others reported seeing boxes labeled ambiguously or items temporarily placed in private offices rather than the official vaults. Each anecdote, while individually minor, built a mosaic of irregularities that could not easily be dismissed. The pattern became undeniable. Someone was manipulating access, moving items, and testing boundaries within a system that had long been considered infallible. The psychological impact on staff was profound. Many who had devoted decades to palace service began to feel betrayed, uncertain, and even fearful. Trust, once implicit, became fragile. A long-serving valet reportedly admitted to investigators that he had begun double-checking colleagues' movements, questioning previously unquestioned routines, and even reviewing security logs more rigorously than ever before. The whispers created a climate of tension, where loyalty and suspicion existed side by side, and every interaction carried potential significance. Public perception, too, played a role. While the rumors were largely confined to palace insiders at first, the media has a way of sensing uncertainty. Journalists with contacts inside the household began picking up on inconsistencies, vague statements, unexplained delays in events, and a subtle tension in Camilla's public appearances. Though no explicit allegations were made initially, the whispers within the palace were amplified once they began leaking into the broader media ecosystem. Speculation about Diana's jewelry, about missing items, and about internal disputes started to take root in public consciousness, feeding the growing scandal. Insiders described the duality of life inside the palace during this period. Outwardly, everything remained polished, ceremonial, and orderly. Camilla attended engagements with impeccable poise, senior staff continued their duties, and the machinery of monarchy operated as expected. Yet beneath the surface, the energy was charged with anxiety, mistrust, and speculation. It was as if the very walls were alive with anticipation, waiting for the moment when the truth would be revealed. And the rumors themselves evolved. Some suggested that the missing jewelry was being prepared for sale, quietly, through intermediaries outside the United Kingdom. Others hinted at internal disputes over who had authorized movements of certain items, creating tension between senior aides, curators, and the royal family. Still others speculated about motives. Was it personal gain, ambition, or an attempt to consolidate influence within the household? Each whisper carried a kernel of truth, but the full picture remained obscured, tantalizing, and increasingly volatile. One particularly intriguing report came from a curator who had worked closely with Diana's personal collection. She claimed that certain items seemed out of place in storage, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate rearrangement. It was subtle, she recalled, almost imperceptible, but anyone who had worked with these items for years could tell. Something was being tested, and someone knew exactly what they were doing. This insider perspective reinforced the idea that the disappearance of the jewelry was not a chaotic act, but a calculated operation, executed with precision and forethought. The whispers also began to affect palace morale. Staff who were once cohesive started acting cautiously, avoiding conversations and interactions that could be interpreted as disloyal. Alliances shifted quietly, with some aides aligning with those they trusted, while others distanced themselves, unwilling to risk association with a potential scandal. Even small decisions, such as who delivered messages or who monitored certain vaults, became politically charged, underscoring the high stakes within the palace walls. And then came the first reports that linked the disappearance directly to Camilla. Initially, these were just rumors, tentative and speculative. Staff noticed patterns in her interactions, timing of visits to certain areas, and subtle references in conversations. While nothing was overt, the convergence of these observations created an undeniable impression. Someone close to the crown had knowledge, access, and potentially motive. For investigators, this was a crucial turning point, shifting the inquiry from generalized suspicion to targeted focus. But the most disturbing aspect of the rumors was their reach. Even as staff whispered, subtle leaks made their way into external circles. Media outlets, keenly attuned to the slightest disruption within the royal household, began asking questions. Although no concrete evidence had yet surfaced publicly, speculation began to swirl around the world. Could Diana's jewelry really have been moved without authorization? Could someone so close to the monarchy, so trusted, be involved? And, most provocatively, was the very sanctity of the palace's legacy at risk? Insiders suggest that the combination of fear, loyalty, and curiosity created a perfect storm. Staff were caught between protecting the institution, maintaining their own positions, and confronting evidence that was increasingly impossible to ignore. Each whisper, each observation, each small anomaly fed into a growing narrative of suspicion and potential betrayal. And as the layers of intrigue grew, it became clear that this was no longer a minor discrepancy. It was a scandal that could redefine public perception of the royal family. And then, just when it seemed the palace was grappling with rumors alone, hard evidence began to emerge. Documents, shipping records, and witness statements that transformed whispers into facts. The question shifted from could this be true to who was responsible and what would be the fallout. The whispers had set the stage, but the revelations that followed would ignite a storm the monarchy had never experienced before. What came next would expose the full extent of the conspiracy, the audacity of the alleged orchestrators, and a chain of events that would shock not only palace staff, but the world. The moment the palace could no longer ignore the disappearance of Diana's jewelry, a formal investigation was quietly initiated. Unlike the publicized inquiries we see in media, this was a discreet operation, conducted behind closed doors, shielded from cameras, journalists, and the general public. The stakes were enormous. The monarchy's reputation, centuries of tradition, and public trust hung in the balance. And from the very start, it was clear that this investigation would be as complex as it was sensitive. Investigators were brought in from both internal palace security and external specialists, each selected for discretion and expertise. Their first task was daunting: to reconstruct a chain of custody for dozens of items, some of which had not been seen in public for years. Inventory logs, security footage, staff schedules, and shipping records were meticulously examined. Every detail was scrutinized, from the movement of small brooches to the handling of large, high-profile necklaces. Nothing